But we're talking about the reason why the United States is where it is right now, and the primary reason has to do with a clash of worldviews. Everything that we heard tonight from Ken, and especially as you think about when Michael asked him a question with business and business strategies, and Ken's answer was the Scriptures, right? The wisdom of the Scriptures. This mindset, this used to be a common mindset, right? And now this is not a common mindset. And the disconnect is thick, right, between one set of the population and the other set, and that disconnect is surrounding a different worldview, right? So one portion of this country, whether you're a believer or not a believer per se, you have a biblical or a Judeo-Christian worldview. Your worldview is rooted in the understanding of the world as the Scriptures present it. And then there's another subset of the population that sees the world, and it's not a stretch to say sees the world as the devil presents it. It is the other side, and we call that humanism today. Religious humanism, secular humanism, whatever you want to call it. What it is it is the opposite. It's the opposite of the Bible, right? It's anti-Bible. In the Bible, they call it the spirit of Antichrist. Right? It is the opposite way of thinking about the world that is around us. And the United States was founded upon a biblical worldview, which is why the founding documents are what they are. And we talked about those things last time. And I gave you kind of a little bit of the history of the United States as related to the biblical worldview, and how it used to be that the disagreements in the United States politically were disagreements surrounding the nuances of how you bring about the solutions to problems, all with an agreement that truth exists, that men are men and women are women, and all of these fundamental agreements, and then there were disagreements as it related to solutions. And of course, there's always been, it's not to say that the entire nation was Christian or anything of the sort. There's always been those things. But after World War II, everything changed. And it actually began well before that. 1859, Charles Darwin puts out his book on Darwinian evolution. Karl Marx does his writings on Marxism, and Sigmund Freud talks about his Freudian psychology. And these three men formulate through each of their individual philosophies effectively an entire way of thinking that is outside of the biblical way of thinking. Through Charles Darwin came the determination that man was brought about by random chance processes outside of a process of creation. Karl Marx is the future. So Charles Darwin is the past, explains the past. Karl Marx explains the future. Whereas the Bible says that there's coming a day where Jesus will return and he will set up a kingdom on this earth, and he will rule and reign in righteousness, and he will get rid of war, and he'll get rid of pain, and he'll get rid of sickness and all of these things. Karl Marx set up a humanistic utopia that says we as humans can get rid of all of it, can bring about a kingdom of our own, and we'll get rid of pain, and we'll get rid of poverty, and we'll get rid of, and it's through the idea of bringing everybody down to, and the word that one would use there would be, it would be equity, not equality in our lingo today, right? The idea that in order to get everybody to get everybody the same height, you chop the legs off of all the tall people, is basically what equity is, and that's the idea of Marxism, which says that we cannot rest until everybody is on the same plane in society, not equal opportunity, but equal outcome. And it is something which resonates in the human condition, but it is a fundamental denial of reality as it exists until Jesus comes and does it for us. So Karl Marx replaced what we call Christian eschatology, or Christian, the view of the end of the world that the Christians had. Charles Darwin replaced the idea of Christian origins. And then Sigmund Freud dealt with the final thing, which was, what do I do with all this guilt that I feel inside of me? All this shame. What do I do with all of the reality of my flaws? And of course, he blamed that all on the psyche, id, ego, superego, all of that, and brought it all to naturalistic explanations. And through these three men, what society was able to effectively do is strip God out of every part of the equation. And it created an entirely alternate path of thinking for people, whereby you had a biblical worldview and you had a humanistic worldview, and these came into a clash one with another. And this really hit home in World War II, after World War II in the United States. After World War I, Europe was done. Europe was, they were a post-Christian nation, and they were on their path, and now we are starting to see the fruits of that with an entire continent that does not have any willingness to defend their values, right? Which is why immigration is happening over there in a way that is absolutely collapsing, effectively, countries. And that's, we're about a generation or two behind Europe, typically, the United States is, and all of these things. So unless something changes, that's the path we're on as well. But the United States, a lot of this happened after World War II, where the people came home and there was a lot of disillusionment, and the country began to go in a somewhat different direction as you think of the 60s and the 70s, right, and the Cultural Revolution that took place and everything else. So, the tenets of humanism. We talked about the tenets of biblical Christianity last time. Let's talk a little bit about humanism. Now, humanism is a religion. They can call it whatever they want, but it is a religion. And why is it a religion? Well, because it, like any other worldview, relies upon fundamental presuppositions and assumptions that cannot be proven. And then you build upon that a way of thinking and a way of acting. So humanism is a religion. Now, I'm going to read to you the tenets of the Humanist Manifesto from 1933. They've updated this every 40 years. So they updated it in 1973, and they updated it again in 2003. The reason why I'm not giving you the updated ones is, first, they're a lot longer. But second, because they've gone from telling you out in the open what they're thinking to hiding things, right? Right? So now they're couching everything in language. But it's all based upon this idea. So these were the tenets from the Humanist Manifesto, which was signed by a number of people, including politicians, people in the education field, people, many church leaders as well, ironically. Of course, they weren't, I didn't say many Christians, right? They weren't Christians, but they were church leaders. For these overthrown churches. But the basic tenets are as follows. The universe is uncreated and self-existing. No God, right? Not created, has always existed. Man is a part of nature and has emerged as a result of a continuous process. They reject the human dualism of matter and spirit. In other words, there is no spiritual. Man is only matter. So we are only firing synapses. We're only electrical impulses. There's no spiritual anything. There's no connection. There's no God. There's no spirit realm. There's no afterlife. None of that. Religious culture and civilization are a product of gradual development through his environment and society. Man is largely molded by his culture. So the idea there is that the religion as we see it today is basically only developed through cultural means, that our culture has developed religion as a means by which to cope with the necessities of culture itself, right? So we see poor people, so we build into our religion something for poor people, and we see angry people, so we build into our religion something, and then we build in these mythologies in order to as Marx would say, religion is the opiate of the masses, right? In order to manipulate people into acting in a way that we can control. And this is what they believed religion to be and declared it to be. No supernatural or cosmic guarantee of human values. This is a big one. In the Declaration of Independence, the preamble says, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet here we find no guarantee of human values, right? That the only value that any person has is the value that the powerful confer upon them. And if we look at that, we recognize how intrinsically contradictory the values of humanism are to the values of the founding, which were Judeo-Christian values. Religion consists of actions, purposes, and experiences which are humanly significant. Nothing human is alien to religion as long as it functions to satisfy human living. In other words, religion can be anything. It doesn't have to be, because there is no God, there is no moral standard, therefore I can make anything religion. And that's what we're seeing today, right? That when you think of the religious values today of transgenderism, the religious values, they're religious values, right? They have no basis. As Corinne was saying, there are these standards that have no basis in anything factual. These things are philosophical and ideological, which means they are religious in nature. They are not fact-based, right? And they say, but anything that is a part of the human experience can be religious. And of course, there's plenty of things that are part of the human experience that are evil, right? Downright evil. But there is no evil or good if we're the ones who define. If there's no standard, if there's no creator, if there's no higher moral authority, then we decide what's right and wrong. We decide what's good and bad. We decide everything. Culture assigns value. Culture assigns what's right and wrong. And if that's all that there is, well, then the people in power get to determine everything, right? They get to determine what's moral and what isn't. And we're kind of seeing that play out with the Kyle Rittenhouse trial right now, right? The question is, are we in a place where our society can now say, no matter what happens and no matter the circumstances, we are going to dictate to you what is moral and immoral? Or are we still in a society where people look at something and say, no, based upon a set of actual indelible standards, this is wrong or this is right. And it's not our job to define right and wrong, it's our job to identify right and wrong and to align with right and wrong. This is the difference between a biblical worldview, which says right and wrong is written by God, and it's our job to identify and align with it, including our laws, including all of those things, and a humanistic worldview, which says I say what's right and wrong, and it's your job to align with me if I have power. And and whoever has power gets to make the rules, right? And see, the difference is that when God makes the rules, the man in power knows that he has to follow the rules because he has someone above him. The king has someone above him, and that's God, and he knows he'll answer to God.
That's right.
And because he will answer to God, he says, I'm going to treat the people under me right, and I'm going to follow the rules too because there's someone above me. That's a biblical worldview. That was what we see in the founding. Complete realization of human personality is the end goal of man's existence. In other words, me becoming my best self is all that we're here for. The development and fulfillment of human personality is the here and now. In the here and now is the humanist social passion. So just develop yourself, become the best you, and that's it. Now, in a biblical worldview, that's not it, because there's an afterlife. There's something beyond this. And if there's something beyond this, then that matters. I don't just eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow I die, because there's something else to live for. And then humanity will face the crisis of life through knowledge and reason. These attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by culture. In other words, we'll come together, we'll face life together through knowledge and through reason. That will get us through. Think of COVID. Is that what humanity did? We have a crisis. We're going to come together and through knowledge and reason, we're going to face these crises? No, it became a power play. It always becomes a power play. Why? Because humanism is a fairy tale. Because man is inherently sinful. That's why the framers put 3 branches of government in place, that we're all fighting with one another. When the gears are grinding and nothing's getting done in Congress, that's a good day, right? That's on purpose, right? They did that on purpose. Because they were anticipating that all of these ambitious people would be pitted against each other and nothing would get done unless there was true consensus. Of course, that doesn't work now because Congress has abdicated their role entirely. So if you don't have a Congress that wants to do anything because they just want to blame the bureaucracy so they can keep getting elected, they give everything to the executive branch, then that doesn't work anymore, right? But that was the intent. So, but what the humanists said is that We're rational people, and through knowledge and through reason, we can, through attitudes fostered by education and supported by a functional culture, we will forge forward into and be successful. Well, the only reason why that's ever worked is because people have fallen back upon ultimate truth. But humanism doesn't believe in ultimate truth, so when they fall back, there's nothing to catch them. And it becomes power. It becomes dog eat dog. It becomes that intrinsic idea of the weak die and the powerful survive, right? The humanism aims to foster the creative in man and to encourage achievements that add to the satisfaction of life. Not necessarily a problem there. All associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. The purpose of humanism is the intelligent evaluation, transformation, control, and direction of associations and institutions with a view to enhance human life. So, not necessarily a bad thing if you were to couch that or if you were to filter that through the idea that there's more to life than this life. But if this is all there is, well then everything becomes temporal. And if everything becomes temporal, if everything is about the here and now, then I've got to get mine while I'm here, because that's all I got, right? And these are the tenets of humanism. And humanism really came into play after World War II. And that's where, and one of the signers of this was John Dewey. And if you're familiar, he was one of the early founders of much of the American education system. And so we find here that the education system became one of the central places, and they started by placing people in the high ups in the universities, right? And then that has filtered down over time. And because of our disassociated, our federalistic system, whereby schools were run locally, local schools, that had been incubated from the government for quite some time, and even incubated from a lot of these institutions. But of course, that's changing now as well. That the federal government found out that with enough money, they can get anywhere they want to go. And so we're finding it now working its way down. So why all of this? Why do we talk about this? What is this about? Well, we've got a lot more to talk about. Oh, no, I'm not done yet. This is a big one. This is the Humanistic Manifesto still, okay? The existing acquisitive and profit-motivated society is inadequate and so must experience a radical change in methods, controls, and motives. A socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. The goal of humanism is a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. Humanists demand a shared life and a shared world. So this is Marxism, right? This is the idea, again, equity, not equality. This is the idea that everybody, well, to each according to his ability, for each according to their need, type idea, which is great if it could possibly work, but it can't possibly work, right? Not with sin nature. They say the acquisitive and profit-motivated society is inadequate. Well, yes, it's not a good thing that everybody wants and has profit motive, but it's an intrinsic part of humanity that people are motivated by benefit, right? If there's no benefit, then I have no motivation. I don't know, for those of you, Sam's not here tonight. They were actually on their way and they hit a deer. So if you think about Sam and Andrea, you can pray for them. They're fine. Thank the Lord for that. Their car is not.
Does their fish have meat in it though?
Yeah, they got to keep the deer. They specifically told me that. So, yeah, so that was the important part. But in Sam's teaching, he's taught before. He hasn't taught in here, but actually he's teaching it right now at our church. And he's teaching on the beginning of the first Thanksgiving. There's a lot of misinformation about that first Thanksgiving. One of the things that those pilgrims found when they came here is that initially they tried to have kind of a commune system. And it didn't work because there was no motivation for anyone to do any work. And as soon as they gave people private property and said, you're working for your own now, everyone worked. They did a great job, and there was enough left over for them then to come together and to share. once they were motivated that they could have their own property, right? This is human nature. This is who we are. And so the humanistic idea is one that has a right concept. Would that we were all so selfless that we could pour into one another in this way. But outside of Christ, now in Christ, that selflessness is intended to be there. But in the world, it's not going to happen. Not until Christ comes and makes it happen. Right? And that's the idea here. I think that's... So the United States now exists in these two worlds, divided along these incompatible worldviews. And I'm going to stop there, but I remind you of this, and next week is Thanksgiving. I remind you of this as we finish here tonight. Next time we'll talk about this battle a little bit more. There is a great deal that we can do by going out there and by talking at these school board meetings, by engaging with these folks, by asking and even throwing our weight around a little bit to whatever extent we can to get done what needs to get done to protect our communities, to protect our families. But if you are interacting with people that have a fundamentally humanistic worldview, and when you're dealing with the schools in particular, you're dealing with a lot of that. They have been taught this stuff, and it's been just drilled into them. When you're dealing with that, you've got to go deeper than just making them do what you want because they feel pressure that they're not going to get elected again. You have to reason for a biblical worldview. You have to reason for the idea that man is naturally, inherently sinful, and so there have to be checks and balances put in place. You have to reason for the ideas of absolute truth. That truth is not malleable, that I can't just define truth to be whatever I want it to be. Now, I can do that, but that's called an opinion, right? That's what we used to call them. But there is a layer above that that doesn't change, no matter who you are. That's real truth, right? Absolute truth, God's truth. And it doesn't change no matter how you feel about it. It does not change. And we need to reason for that. And we need to encourage people to see that. And we need to help people along in that process of understanding that. So when you're around the dinner table at Thanksgiving, and you're dealing with people, okay, so let's talk about some scenarios here, right? So you're dealing with someone, and they're afraid, right? There's no fear in love. Perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love, the Scriptures tell us. Right? So fear is something which in Christ we ought not have, because God is our keeper. He's the one that watches the wall. But people are fearful. Well, if you're a humanist, or if you've been built on a humanistic, even if you go to church and you claim Christ, but you have been inculcated by a humanistic way of thinking that from the world around you. I tell my people, now my church is all homeschoolers, so we don't deal with the public schools in our church. Not to say we kick out anyone that's not. It's just the way our church has been. Our church has a lot of homeschool people in it. But when I first joined the public school advisory council, and we went around the room and they said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "The reason why I'm here is because I get kids for 3 hours a week, and you get kids for a whole lot more than that. And so it makes my job a lot harder if I'm not involved in what you're teaching them, because I've got to undo it all on Sunday, right?" And that idea that even these kids that are in churches, they're hearing, 3 hours, and that's assuming their church teaches anything. And then they get, their teachers get them for how many hours a week, right? And so our children, even though they might know Christ and know their Bibles, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're thinking along a biblical worldview. So maybe they're afraid, and maybe that person's wearing that mask because they're afraid, and maybe they're afraid because they think that this life is effectively all there is. And maybe the problem is that they don't have a perspective whereby they have any confidence in the life that is to come. Well, that's a solvable problem. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take patience, and it's going to take love. It's not going to take mocking. Mocking them is not going to do it. Tearing them down is not going to do it. Now, we can talk about, we can badger back and forth. Oh, you're anti-science. No, you're anti-science. And we can do that all day. But we need to understand that when you're talking about worldviews, now I tell people this when I'm talking about the worldview of creationism. I'm a young earth creationist. I don't believe that evolution was the way that things came about, and we can have that discussion in another forum if anyone ever wanted to. But when I'm contending for this, when I'm contending for young earth creation, I give examples, and I say, take the Grand Canyon, for example. What I tell them is this: evidence doesn't tell you anything. Evidence has to be interpreted, right? So if I look at evidence, say the Grand Canyon, an evolutionist looks at the Grand Canyon and they say, a little bit of water over millions of years. Sediment layers, each one of those layers is millions of years, right? When I look at the Grand Canyon, I see a lot of water over 40 days. Now, here's the thing. We're both looking at the same evidence, but we're interpreting it different ways. And here's what I could do. If I went and I got a big thing of dirt, and I take all that dirt and I throw it into a big old jar of water and I shake it up, it's going to layer when it settles by the weight of the granules, right? It's going to layer by weight. So I can look at the Grand Canyon and I can see those layers and I can say, evidentiarily speaking, through the lens of my worldview, I see a lot of water, a little time, it all gets shooken up because the whole world is underwater, and then when it settles, there's a big old canyon and it's got layers. Now, they see a different thing through their interpretive lens. That's okay. But if I argue with them just upon evidence, here's the thing, we're seeing the same evidence. The question is, how are we interpreting the evidence? And the way I interpret the evidence is going to be based upon the glasses that I'm seeing them through. Am I looking through the Bible or am I looking through humanism? If I'm interpreting that evidence through humanism, I'm going to see something entirely different than if I'm interpreting through the Bible. And so if people aren't looking at the world through a biblical lens, if they're not looking at the Constitution through a biblical lens, they're not going to see a good document. If they're looking through a humanistic lens, they're going to see a document that is flawed, in their way, racist, everything, right? Name it, a limiting document. Because those principles of human dignity, those principles of absolute truth, those principles don't mean anything to them because they're looking through a lens of humanism. So we have to help them change their lens, or at least understand. If you want them to at least understand you, explain to them that you're wearing a different set of glasses. Instead of just saying, no, you don't know the science, or they don't know the science, or whoever doesn't know the science, say, well, let's go one more layer down. Instead of talking about the science, whatever that means, let's talk about how we're looking at this data. Let's talk about the lens. And until we can start to help people see the lens, we're not really going to gain any ground. Now, we might win battles and push a little this way, then they'll push a little that way. But if we want to gain the ground, we've got to change the lens through which people are looking. And of course, I say we. For those who are in Christ, we recognize that that's not our job. Our job is to tell. God's job is to change the hearts, right? That's what God does. It's an inside-out deal. But that's the worldview clash that we're in right now. And we can fight, we can play the power play game, but what we've really got to do is we've got to help people change the lenses through which they're looking at the world, if they're going to understand why the founding has value. And so next time we're together, we'll talk a little bit more. We'll talk about the history, the worldview battle, the history of the Christian worldview, the history of the humanistic worldview. We'll get a little bit more of that context, and then we'll give some strategies for how to do this.